Hey guys, this is John. Game 3 of the World Chess Championship took place yesterday in New York City. This is of course the World Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Sergey Karjakin. The first two games were drawn, relatively uneventful games, and of course you have people screaming that, oh, chess is so boring, why do people watch this? This is the death of chess, all the games at the top level are drawn. But just you wait. This always happens in high-level matches. Inevitably, there is some excitement. And in Game 3, the players produced a masterpiece of a game, in my opinion. It is the most complex game I've ever had the privilege of following live. And I mention that because in this video, I'm just going to hit the highlights of this game. I'm not going to conduct a lengthy analysis because that would take many hours. I think there are some things that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. So take that for what it's worth. I'm just going to hit the highlights in this one and try to break down the most relevant points. So Magnus was white. He opened with e4. Please excuse the very chewed up e-pawn. You might be able to see that on camera. This is thanks to my roommate's dog back in college. Don't worry though, this pawn will soon be traded off. Black played e5. So Karjakin is playing black. Magnus plays knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Roy Lopez. And now we get knight f6, the dreaded Berlin defense. This has a reputation as being very solid and drawish. Every top player at some point or another has relied on this move. Magnus castles. d3 is another move just to defend the pawn. And Karjakin takes the pawn on e4, predictable. And Magnus plays rook e1. So this already means we're not going to get a Berlin endgame, which is possible after white plays d4. So these positions still do have a drawish reputation, however. So rook e1, Karjakin backs up the knight, knight d6, knight takes e5, regaining that pawn. Bishop e7, blocking any trouble down the e-file. Magnus plays the bishop back to f1. And now we get a trade on e5. Knight takes e5, rook takes e5. You see how the pawn structure is completely symmetric at the moment. So Karjakin wants to get his king to safety. He castles. And now d4. Magnus striking in the center. If black has a problem here, it's the fact that the knight is blocking his d-pawn. If he could get this pawn to d5 safely, he would certainly do that. But white is basically arguing that black has some slight issues coordinating his pieces, and that could give white a small advantage, which Magnus is very happy with. He's excellent at playing with small, stable advantages and squeezing his opponent. So after castles, d4, then bishop f6, attacking the rook. And here Magnus played a very funny move, which has already been discussed heavily in the chess world. So the normal move is to back the rook up all the way to e1, where it's safest and it doesn't block either the queen or the bishop. However, Magnus played rook e2 here, and I saw Robert Hess's notes to this game on chess.com, and he went so far as to give this move 2 exclamation points, which is, of course, excessive, but it does point to the fact that this is a very deep move. One of my friends on Facebook, who's a FIDE master, he said there's no chance in the world that he would ever play this move. Like, he just doesn't understand what this move is about. In hindsight, he can kind of understand it, and I'm in the same boat. I mean, that's not a move I would ever come up with on my own, and I don't think Magnus did either. I think this is specific preparation. It has been played before, but only a few times. So the reasoning is to try to provoke some sort of weakening move in black's position. White does not necessarily intend to keep the rook on e2 permanently. In fact, you'll see he puts it back on e1 on the next move, but he wants to try to provoke some concession from black. Here I think rook e8 is just fine if black wanted to oppose white down the file, which black often does in this line. But Karjakin played b6, looking to get the bishop out, potentially to a6 too, to hit that rook. And here's where Carlsen just backed the rook right up to e1. So a nice little subtlety right there. Black has this free move b6, but it may actually be weakening in the long run on this diagonal. So after rook e1, Karjakin played rook e8. Magnus played bishop f4, just developing. We got a trade of rooks on e1. And now Karjakin played queen e7, continuing with his policy of trying to simplify the position. It's possible to take the pawn on here. You might be wondering, why not take this apparently undefended and free pawn? And yes, the pawn was undefended, but after bishop takes d6, c takes d6, queen e4, black is experiencing immediate tactical problems because of the hanging bishop and the hanging rook on a8. So Karjakin doesn't want to venture down that line. So instead, he plays that solid queen e7 move, offering a trade of queens. And Magnus develops, knight c3, just get the knight into the game. Karjakin plays bishop b7. We get a trade of queens on e7. And now a4. So we are in a queenless middle game now. I would not say endgame because there is still plenty of play on the board, lots of pieces still in the mix. So Magnus is doing what you often want to do in queenless middle games, which is to gain space with your pawns. He doesn't see an immediate tactical operation, so a4 is a space-gaining move, attempting to stake out territory for the long run. Black plays a6, g3. So this hints at that earlier rook e2 move and the concession, or slight concession, that Black made by playing b6. Magnus is threatening, in some cases, bishop h3, trying to go and attack the pawn on d7, or bishop g2, just looking to swap for Black's bishop on b7. Karjakin plays g5, striking at that bishop. And now Magnus willingly gives up the dark square bishop for the knight on d6. Interesting decision. And this is perhaps something that Magnus thought about prior to the match, and which I've always felt has been a strength of his, which is playing with the knight. So he has the only remaining knight on the board. It's knight and bishop versus two bishops. Usually the two bishops confers some advantage. You often hear top players talk with great reverence about the two bishops. But you'll see in this game that the pawn structure, in fact, is favorable to white. And that means that Magnus can go to work with this knight, trying to poke and prod at his opponent's structure. And he used the same strategy in game one, where he was torturing Karjakin. Well, torture is a little hard. He was pressing Karjakin, let's say, for a while with a knight versus a bishop. So we get the trade on d6. Magnus plays bishop g2, swap the light square bishop, so more pieces coming off the board. And now Karjakin plays f5. So Karjakin is not going to be pushed around. He's trying to gain space of his own. f5 controls the e4 square. It may also allow his king to come up to the f7 square. King activity becomes increasingly important as more pieces are exchanged. So Magnus plays knight d5, king f7, and now knight e3, repositioning the knight to attack this potentially fresh weakness on f5. Karjakin brings his king up to defend. And now knight c4, so another knight move. The knight is wheeling around all over the place. And this always creates the threat of knight takes d6. Now at this moment, when I was watching the game live, I actually wondered if knight takes d6 was all that bad for Black. And I was wondering why Karjakin didn't just seize the file with rook e8 and say, you know what, go ahead, like double my pawns, but you have immediate issues to solve with my rook coming into e2, maybe even e4 in some cases. Maybe Karjakin was hesitant to give Magnus that opportunity, but I thought this would be a straightforward way of playing. So instead, Karjakin plays bishop f8, so he withdraws the bishop and allows Magnus to seize the file, rook e1. And now he plays rook d8, which looks kind of funny to me, putting the rook on a closed file. And interestingly, Magnus did something similar with the black pieces in the second game, also in a Roy Lopez. So this does preemptively defend the pawn on d7, so it's kind of a prophylactic move, but you got to question like what the rook is really doing here long term. I often tell my students, like, don't put rooks on completely closed files and don't put them behind pawns that you don't expect to move quite quickly. If this move is a prelude to pushing the d-pawn, well, maybe you can make a stronger argument for it, but otherwise, is the rook really going to be useful here? I don't think so. So Magnus plays f4. Now, I mentioned I was going to discuss key moments in this game, and this is the first key moment of the game, in my opinion. So with f4, Magnus is fixing the pawn on f5. He's making this pawn remain stationary for the time being by blocking its advance. And that's crucial because this pawn is a clear target for white in the coming play. And with f4, Karjakin has a tough decision as to what to do with the pawn tension. So the fact that these pawns are attacking each other is something Black has to figure out. Does he leave the pawns where they are? Does he capture on f4? Or does he even try to push past with g4? Now, I don't know for sure, and I wonder if this was asked in the press conference, because Karjakin spent 20 minutes at this point in the game on this next move. And he chose a move which I have a feeling if he could do this game over again, he would not play. So he took on f4. Simplifying the position slightly, but undoubtedly, after this exchange is made, the f5 pawn is a lot weaker than white's f4 pawn. These are both what we would call isolated pawns, meaning they have no pawns on either side of them to help protect them. If they are attacked, they have to be defended by pieces rather than pawns. Isolated pawns are traditionally weaknesses. And I have a feeling that if he could do it over again, he wouldn't play that way. I thought during the game that g4 was the most attractive looking way to deal with this position. This still does make f5 a weakness because the pawn is advanced to a point where it can't protect f5. But I think the fact that the king side is closed is going to benefit black more than it does white. Likewise, I also wonder if black can play h6 here and just support the pawn. I know that that might give the option of taking and then playing h4 at some point, trying to get a passed pawn down the h-file, but I still think it's plausible. So at any rate, Karjakin does make that trade on f4, and the game continues. So now Karjakin plays b5, striking at the queen side. We get a swap between these pawns, and Magnus brings the knight right back to e3, where it was just a short while ago, attacking the pawn on f5. Although it is defended by the king. The main threat here, by the way, is knight d5 check, forking the king into c-pawn. So Karjakin takes a measure against that. He plays c6. Magnus brings up his king, king f3. Karjakin, who is naturally looking for activity, seizes the file with rook a8. And now Magnus plays rook g1. Okay, this is the next key moment, because I can see this internal battle that Karjakin had throughout the game as to whether he should play actively or simply defend, and in some cases even passively defend. Because right now he goes for an active move, which is kind of in the same spirit as taking on f4 and playing b5. He's trying not to lose any time by making moves that would throw the ball back in white's court. So Karjakin here plays rook a2, which in theory looks good. I mean, putting a rook on the second rank where it attacks a number of your pawns in a row is usually a good thing. But many commentators were talking about bishop h6 being a better attempt here. And I'm inclined to agree, because bishop h6 stops the threat of rook g5, with white's rook and knight ganging up on the f5 pawn. The bishop is looking relatively ineffective here, because it is just staring at that pawn on f4, which is defended. But in this exact position, I think that was the best move. So instead he goes for this rook a2 move. Magnus plays b3. And now Karjakin commits a mistake. I think this is another key moment. So key moment number 3 right here. And I have to say already the position is pretty difficult for black. And Karjakin was trying to play actively. He's striving to continue this thread that he started. But he really should just sit tight here. And in fact, I think he should play a pawn move that he was hesitant to play for most of the game, which was d5. I spoke earlier about when that rook was on d8. I thought maybe black should play that only if he had d5 in mind, and I do think that d5 should be played right here, which stops white from playing d5 under any circumstances. It does restrict the knight slightly too. You can see that white's knight has no good forward squares to go to. I suppose even in this position, the pawn on b5 was controlling, for instance, the c4 pawn. But this would make white's task of playing this position a lot tougher, I think. So instead of d5, he plays c5. You can understand why he wants to try to trade pawns too, offering a pawn exchange here. He does have the bishop versus a knight, and usually the more pawns that come off the board, the more that favors the bishop. But this just happens to be a mistake. Magnus plays rook g8, attacking the bishop. Karjakin plays king f7, and now Magnus brings this rook right back to g2, where it overprotects the c-pawn. He's trying to free up his knight so he can win this pawn on f5, which is exactly what happens next. Karjakin takes on d4. Magnus takes on f5, as expected. And now you can see that black's structure is looking even more ragged than white's. Every single pawn that black has here is isolated. And with the d-pawns, he has double isolated pawns. So he decides to just offload this pawn. He plays d3. A correct decision, I think, because now when white takes it, white has all isolated pawns. The c and the b pawns are no longer connected. But black is going to be playing a pawn down from this point forward. And in such cases, you don't want to trade. I know I said a moment ago that with the bishop versus the knight, black would be welcoming trades. But here, if black were to swap off the rooks, he would be doomed, I think, because with an extra pawn for white, and with all of his pawns being safe for the moment, black's bishop is not going to have an easy time at all targeting these pawns. White's knight can just wheel around and create problems for black everywhere. You know, try to attack the B pawn. He'll bring up his king to the center too. Black just can't contemplate this. His rook is his last bastion of activity, and he has to try to maximize this piece. Therefore, he played rook a1, just avoiding the trade. I think rook a3 was a bit better, as many analysts indicated, just attacking the pawn. One idea there is that after rook b2, trying to defend the pawn, black can get the bishop involved as well. Bishop b4, try to get the bishop into c3, and maybe even push pawn to b4 to support it too. So Karjakin puts the rook on a1 instead. I should say that we are now on move 36, and both sides were in time pressure, especially Karjakin. Not a pleasant situation, right? Like, you're facing the best player in the world, you're down a pawn in exactly the type of positions that Magnus is exceptional at, positions where he has a stable advantage and can just grind you and set up tactical tricks and just overall torture you, and you're in time pressure. So, an unenviable situation for Karjakin. Magnus plays knight d4, and, oh, I'm sorry, this bishop is back here. So knight d4 attacking the pawn on b5. Karjakin pushes that pawn. So this pawn is defended by the bishop, but that's not all great because it does restrict the bishop's movement too. So now rook g5 happens. Karjakin gets behind the pawn, rook b1. There's a check on f5, king e8. Magnus swings the rook over to b5. There's some maneuvering at this stage of the game. So rook f1 check, king e4, and now rook e1. And here we're on move 40. There was time added to both sides' clocks, so they can take a bit of a breather. Karjakin made the time control successfully. Magnus played king f5, so you can see that white is advancing here. He's not pushing his pawns yet, but he is increasing the scope of his pieces, and in some cases even creating direct problems for the black king. Karjakin plays rook d1, targeting that d-pawn. And now another key moment here. So Magnus decided to go for rook e5 check in this position, but as many people pointed out, and I definitely agree, I think rook b8 would have been a stronger move. So checking the black king, and after rook b8, black has to be careful where to step with his king. King f7 looks like the desirable move, keeping the bishop, defending the pawn. But after knight f3, you can see that this knight is again wheeling around and indirectly defending the d-pawn. If black were to play rook takes d3, he runs right into the fork, knight e5 check. Instant resignation. So that means that on this rook b8 check move, black would be inclined to play king e7, but that's clearly an ugly move. And I think if white just played something like king e4 here, defending the d-pawn, the torture would continue. Rook takes b4 as a threat. I think Magnus should have pressed a little bit here before allowing black to trade a pair of pawns, as you'll see that black is able to do in the game. So instead of that rook b8 move, Magnus played rook e5. Surprising too, because Magnus is extremely patient. He's shown throughout his career in these endgames that he's never in a rush. He's content to just torture people as much as possible. So now rook d5, attacking the d-pawn, but allowing black to take on d3, which is a bit of a win for black because that means he's that much closer to a potential draw. If you're fighting for a draw, oftentimes you want to swap as many pawns as you can. If you swap as many pawns as you can, that's one less opportunity for your opponent to try to make a queen someday. So rook to d5 now, retreating the rook, defending the knight. Rook swings over to h3. Karjakin's rook really put in work in this game. It was just swooping all over the place, trying desperately to create counter threats. So check, king f7, and now rook back to e2, defending the h2 pawn. Black tries to activate his bishop, naturally. Bishop g7, knight c6. And now Karjakin plays rook h5, check, which I don't think he was too happy about. It would be really nice for him to take on b3, right? So just pick up this pawn. But the problem is, after knight d8 check, so delivering a check from an unusual location, and king f8, knight e6 check, king f7, this knight cycles around to g5 with check, forking the king and the pawn on h7, and the computers already indicate a forced mate here. I think it was like mate in 15 or something. If king g8 trying to defend the pawn, then this rook is coming into e8. Black would have to block with the bishop. And you can see how clustered white's pieces are around the black king. You know, a move like, I think king f6 would be good here. Threatening knight e6, pinning this bishop, double attacking it, and the black b pawn is not nearly fast enough to create any meaningful counter chances. So that must have been a bummer for Karjakin to realize that he couldn't actually take this pawn on b3, despite how juicy and tempting it looks. So this was with the position, the knight on d4 and king on f7. And this is here too. So in this position, he gave that check on h5. Magnus backed the king up to g4. And now rook over to c5, hitting the knight. And here, white could go astray by taking the pawn on b4. But after rook b5, he would get this pawn back, because if the knight moves, rook takes b3 will be played. Note that if rook e4, we could always go and attack that knight with a move like bishop f8 coming up, or bishop c3. So instead, he delivers the check on d8, as in the previous line. So knight d8 check, black plays king g6, knight e6, Karjakin plays h5 check, king to f3, and now rook c3 check. Magnus plays king e4. And again, this pawn is untouchable. If rook takes b3, this time white has a different angle to attack black. He can play rook g2 check, and once the king moves, the bishop on g7 will be falling. So again, he's indirectly defending that b3 pawn. Therefore, Karjakin plays bishop f6. Now some more maneuvering. Rook e3, h4. I mentioned earlier that black does not want to allow a trade of rooks without good cause. Here he would have good cause, because if rook takes c3, b takes c3, suddenly this pawn is threatening to promote in 2 moves, and it would draw the attention of the white king, most likely. I guess white could also think about knight c5, but in this case, there's a nice little tactical move at the end, bishop b2, supporting the pawn in its path towards promotion. So if king d3 was played in this position, then black gets a chance to play king f5, activating the king, hitting the knight plus the pawn, and black is suddenly in a great position here. Definitely will draw this game. So white can't exchange rooks like that, as much as he would like to simplify. So after h4, Magnus just played h3, which I think was criticized by some commentators. It was apparently better to play knight f6, knight f8 check, and then after the king move like king f7, play knight d7, which would in fact threaten to go into a pawn endgame. Knight takes f6, king takes f6, rook takes c3, b takes c3, king d3. And in that resulting position, white would have 2 pawns, which black would be unable to stop. So that looked like a better opportunity for white. But instead, h3 is played. Karjakin again moves this rook. So rook c1, knight f8 check, king f7, knight d7, king e6, knight b6, rook d1, f5 check, king f7, knight c4, rook d4 check. And with this move, they make move 60. And now we're in the 3rd time control of the game. I believe the players got 15 minutes with that 30-second increment continuing. So final time control of the game. Time pressure was really kicking in at this point. King f3. Karjakin plays bishop g5. So you can see over the course of the last few moves, it looks like black has succeeded in activating some of his pieces. But there is still misery to come for black. Rook e4. Karjakin checks. Magnus plays the king up. And suddenly Magnus's king becomes very active after rook g3, king h5. He's pushing for the win here. He knows that he's had a golden opportunity in this game, and he's not taking it for granted, even though it looks like black is becoming more active. Black can't take the pawn on h3 because he would lose the bishop on g5. So Karjakin backs this bishop up to e7. But now Magnus's knight comes back into the picture. Knight e5 check. He moved this knight quite a bit in this game. It'd be cool to see a graph of how this knight moved around the board. Some sort of illustration of that. So king f6, knight g4 check. Note that if king takes f5, that's going to leave the bishop undefended. I think after this, it's actually most accurate to play rook e5 check before picking up the bishop. So white is taking advantage of the black king and its need to stay tied to the defense of the bishop. King f7, rook e6, rook takes h3. Rook e6 was an exceptional move, by the way, because now, even though white has jettisoned the h-pawn, he's going to get knight e5 check. And with the rook on e6 supported by the pawn and the knight participating in the attack, Black, in fact, has to give up the bishop now. So not a happy situation. I would say that this was probably the highest drama point in the game when it became clear that Magnus was going to win this bishop. And that's because if king f8, trying to stick close to the bishop, white has knight g6 check with the fork. And similarly, if king e8, black is walking into f6, and that bishop is pinned. So what is Karjakin to do? He has to play king g7 or king g8. And he correctly plays king g7. Magnus wins the bishop with check. It's looking all over, right? But not so fast. After king f6, you can see that white has coordination issues. This king attacks the rook on e7, also eyes the knight on e5, and the pawn on f5. So now black's strategy is clear. Karjakin is trying to eliminate all of white's remaining pawns. He wants to win f5 and b3, because with king and rook against king, rook, and knight, assuming that white also eliminates these pawns, that is a theoretical draw. And it's a pretty straightforward one, too. So he knows that if he can take these remaining pawns, that he has a draw in his pocket. So Magnus has to keep one of these pawns at all costs, or set up a mating net, which is not going to happen here. So Magnus plays knight c6, supporting the rook. And this is another key moment. Okay? So black has a choice in this position, which pawn to take. King takes f5 or rook takes b3. We're on move 70, very late in the game. Time is dwindling. You're in the world championship. I mean, the pressure must be enormous at this point. And Karjakin faltered here. He took the pawn on f5, when in fact it would have been better to play rook takes b3. And there's a very study-like draw, or no, I'm sorry. It would not have been better to play rook takes b3. See, even I get confused in this ending. He wants to take the pawn on b3, but first he should actually play rook c3, so harassing this knight. And again, you can see the coordination issue for white. If the knight moves away, then king takes e7 will be played. So after rook c3, white could play rook e6 check, king takes f5, knight d4 check. And this finally allows the king to roam, so king f4, but not so fast, because after even a move like knight e2 check, king f5, knight takes c3, king takes here, you can see that white is still going to have issues with the knight being threatened, also the h-pawn threatening to run. That's probably going to draw the attention of the white knight. Black can go around the king and win that remaining pawn. So I had a variation, which I think many other analysts showed in this position. So after knight d4 check, king f4, white can take on h4. The knight is still defending the pawn here. But after rook d3, black has just enough in the tank to draw this game, trying to force the knight away so he can take the pawn. A cool variation is knight e2 check, king f3, knight c1. So trying desperately to defend the b pawn again. Rook d1, attacking the knight. Rook c6. Looks like white has everything covered. Rook defending the knight. Maybe white can start slowly bringing the king back into the play. But after king e3, threatening king d2, rook c2, and now this move, rook d2, offering a trade of rooks. Black has just enough to hold the position. A rook trade is going to result in a draw, and after the rook moves away somewhere, like let's say rook c8, I think just rook right back to d1. And with the threat of king d2, black is going to make this draw that he's been looking for. So that's a tough variation. You can see that even in analysis, knowing the line, it's still difficult to execute all the moves because some of them don't make a lot of sense. But that was the correct way for black to play. So back in this position, so this is here, rook on e7, knight here, where black was facing this choice whether to take on f5 or play the rook somewhere. Rook c3 was in fact the best move. So black should have done that to try to attack this knight. So instead, king takes f5 was played, and this is Magnus's biggest chance all game. He's played a brilliant game. He's been pressuring black, pushing Karjakin to the outer limits of his defensive abilities, and here he could have capitalized. But again, it's move 71. Time pressure is in full swing, and Magnus falters. He's not quite up to the task. So the best move here was rook e1, bringing the rook to the back rank. And the point is, rook takes b3 is not possible. If black swipes this pawn, then knight d4 check is played, forking the king and the rook. So for now, the pawn on b3 is safe. And I could demonstrate why this move works. Black has to move the king to try to pick up the pawn here. So let's say king f4. Note that here, if rook c3, I think the problem is that after knight e7 check, black's king is going to be forced into a fork. King f6 or king f4 will run into knight d5, forking the king and the rook. So black doesn't have this king c3 resource in this case. So on king f4, trying to threaten rook takes b3, white can deliver a check here, king here, and now black can safely play knight to a5, supporting the pawn here. And unlike in the situation that occurs in the game, white's rook on the first rank is very helpful because that could potentially stop black's runaway h-pawn. So this is the big difference that you'll see compared to what happened in the game. So going back to the game position, instead of rook e1 here, Magnus played the immediate knight a5. Understandably, he wants to preserve his remaining b-pawn, but Karjakin, summoning up all his defensive abilities here, plays correctly from this point forward. So rook h1. Now it should be noted that Magnus still has chances here, and his next move is really the one that gives away the draw. Or gives away the win, rather. He plays rook b7, and apparently it would have been best to play rook f7 check, and then after the king moves, like let's say it goes here to attack, this move rook f2. And I believe the reasoning for that is, again, to try to keep the rook in a position where it can stop the black h-pawn. White's king is too far away from the h-pawn to properly chase it, but with rook here, white has their bases covered as far as defending this, and the rook, in addition to maybe being able to defend the b-pawn or assist in the defense of the b-pawn, has chances to stop the black h-pawn too. So that's what he needed to find at this late stage in the game. Instead, he played rook b7. He's going directly for the black b-pawn. But Karjakin plays rook a1, attacking the knight on a5. Magnus gives a check. Karjakin charges forward, king f4. He's saying, go ahead, take on b4 with check, which white does. And now king g3. And herein lies the big problem for Magnus, and what does not allow him to win. It's the fact that black has the h-pawn, and that h-pawn is becoming increasingly dangerous. It's only 3 squares away from promotion, and suddenly, in addition to black's rook supporting the h1 queening square, black's king is involved as well. And white is all gummed up over here. It took a while to bring the knight around to a5 to defend b3, and it also was time-consuming to go and capture the b-pawn. And white doesn't have anything to do here. He delivered a check on g4. Karjakin played king f2. The h-pawn is attacked twice, but if he pauses to take it, then black immediately takes the knight on a5. White is still up a pawn, but white's king is not nearly close enough to be able to assist. This is just an immediate draw. Same thing if rook takes h4. So the only chance is to try to defend the knight, save the knight somehow. Magnus plays knight c4, maybe hoping to get the knight back in the picture in order to stop the h-pawn. But after h3, rook h4, king right back to g3, the h-pawn is threatening to go to h2, and white's knight is playing no role in stopping that pawn. Therefore, Magnus played rook g4 check. Black played king f2, and with this move they agree to draw. Move 78, game drawn. A titanic struggle. Adjectives kind of fail to describe how complicated that is, and again, I cut some corners as far as the analysis goes because to give you guys the entire breakdown of this game would take well over an hour in my opinion. But hopefully that cued you into some of the major moments in this game, which you can see mostly took place once they got to that endgame with king, rook, and knight and many pawns for Magnus versus king, rook, and bishop and pawns for Sergey Karjakin. So really a beautiful game. I know that without decisive games, people are sometimes screaming for more blood and they're disappointed that one side didn't win. But I think this game is like a testament to how complicated and beautiful chess is, even in the absence of a decisive result. So I know many chess fans enjoyed following this game, and I'm sure the analysis of this game will be much discussed, as it already has been. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this. Game 4 is in progress as we speak, and we'll see how that one turns out. All right, guys, talk to you later. Bye.